If you had one final bit of advice, like one thing to emphasize for team leaders and how to make the process effective for students, what would it be? Is there a tool? Is there a thing that like, hey, if you want to start somewhere doing something important, this is what it would be?
So I think one thing that we haven't talked about is transition assessment. And that's a really critical part of this transition planning process. And I think, again, considering transition assessment in really a holistic way is going to be helpful. So when we look at IDEA, it says that these post-secondary goals, so that's the student's vision statement, needs to be based off of age-appropriate transition assessment. So the thing, once we hear assessment, a lot of times, again, people get nervous and is there an evaluation consent form involved? What do we have to do? What's the one tool that's going to provide all the information that we need? So I think one thing that team leaders can think about is transition is an ongoing process of data collection. And it's what's naturally happening for, by and large, most of the students, it's naturally happening. At the state level, we have guidance from one of the technical advisories from DESE around what transition assessment is. And I think it was released in 2014. It gives really good examples of what transition assessment is. So things like MCAS scores, report cards, that's all part of transition assessment. It's just how do we utilize that information? So for example, if a student would like to go to college, but they haven't passed their MCAS yet, that's part of the assessment process. We know this about the student, they haven't passed. To get to high school diploma, what do we have to do? What do we need to change? Right. Transition assessment isn't one thing. And I think a lot of times people reach out to me and say, so what's the tool that I can use to make sure we're covered on transition assessment? You want to think holistically about transition assessment. A lot of times, naturally through guidance, students are accessing Naviance or some kind of software that's going to guide their process and involve things like interest inventories, personality inventories, resume writing. That's all part of transition assessment and can be used to inform that transition planning process. So I think as team leaders go into meetings, they can know that there's a lot of information out there. We just need to figure out how to capture it in a way that's going to inform the team and then inform those post-secondary goals. The other thing to just keep in mind, because goals are confusing, we have IEP goals based on disability, and then we have post-secondary goals, and those are two different things. So I also just want to make sure anytime I work with staff that they know they don't need to have an IEP goal that's labeled education or transition or employment. So when we talk about post-secondary goals, that's the vision statement. So that's going to be in the student vision statement, and that vision statement needs in the student's voice, which is again a big shift. But the guidance from DESE is actually not to have an IEP goal area labeled transition, because the perspective is that everything in the IEP starting by age 14 is related to transition. So you don't necessarily often, I really never see, I think at this point, an IEP goal area labeled transition, because we should be capturing transition objectives throughout all of those different IEP goal areas. So for example, if a student wants to become a biologist and they struggle with writing, one of their objectives might be related to increasing their independence in writing a 5-paragraph essay or writing a research report. That's a transition related objective because they would like to become a biologist. Therefore, they're going to have to increase their independence in writing science related things. So again, I guess my message around transition is it is holistic and everything is related to transition. So use that mindset of transition assessment, pull from everyone when you're thinking about what a student is currently doing. And it might be that a student gets to 11th grade and we've never done an interest inventory. Well, that might be an action step then that either guidance takes care of, or mass rehab, or the special education team, or a counselor. So there might be specific tools that you have to end up accessing for transition assessment, but I also want people to know there isn't just one thing that you use. That's where it's so important to be collaborative with guidance, with your community-based champions, to say, you know, sometimes MRC can do vocational assessments, which can provide really good information, or they can give you access. Our MRC person has given us sample assessment tools that she says, this might be helpful before we get to that point. just try this transition to work survey with the student. That could give some really good information before our next meeting. So again, I just wanted to touch on transition assessment because I think having that understanding that it's an ongoing process of data collection before you go into meetings is really important. Are there times that you might do a formal transition evaluation through an evaluation consent form? Those times certainly do come, but by and large, transition assessment is covered by doing all of the data collection that you're naturally doing as part of the student's special education and general education experience.
Yeah, I think that actually, I'm glad you brought up transition assessment and the connection between the kind of post-secondary goals, the vision, right, and the annual goals that you could easily, take that information you're gathering in an ongoing way and identify it in a current level of educational performance as a team leader and say, this is the connection to the long-term goal. This is why we're doing this.
Right.
So I really appreciate your time today, Jill. This was a fabulous conversation about transition planning and I think very practical.
I think you cut out a little bit. I don't know. Sorry.
It's okay. I know we're having some trouble with our audio and video, but do you have any questions for me about what the next, you're going to email me some stuff and
Yep.
then we'll make this available.
Yeah, so I'm going to finish up the module. I'm just looking through my notes from the questions that you sent me just to see if there's anything that I didn't necessarily touch on in my answers. And it looks like my main focus was collaboration.
Right.
Again, taking advantage of those community-based partners as well as your partners in school is going to be really important. I want to make sure I covered everything. Yeah, again, I think it's just being upfront with the shift of the conversations that are happening. That's really important. And I think it's just addressing it and people feel more comfortable talking about transition when they know this is what we're going to talk about. It's really important, but it's also, especially for that 14-year-old, we're talking about life after high school, and that's okay if you say, I like animals. I don't know if I want to be a vet. I don't know if I want to work in a pet store. That's okay and developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
But it's important that we're at least acknowledging the student has interests. What are things that we can put in place or help the family put in place to help address some of those things? So I think that was the only thing from my notes that I hadn't necessarily touched on, that it's okay that your vision statement is going to change every year, and it should change every year because it's based on transition assessment. So once you take MCAS, that's going to change kind of what things are going to look like. Once you enter high school and start taking different types of classes, that's going to change your vision statement. You might be exposed to different things that now I thought I wanted to be a plumber, but now I've had the experience and I think that I want to do something else. Maybe I want to work in culinary, or maybe I want to go to college. So we also need to recognize that these are just like any 14 to 22-year-old, things change all the time, and that's okay. And that's why we really want to update the TPF and keep using transition assessments and gather information that's going on in the person's life to say, okay, we're going to shift gears now. High school diploma is still the goal, but we're going to look at a different interest area. So I think that was the only other thing for my notes.
Yeah, I like how you're emphasizing self-determination and that shift away from adult, parent, educator directed, goals and planning to student directed planning with support and with guidance. But the fact that the student really is, we're trying to equip the student to determine the course of the next steps in their lives.